Winter on the American frontier was not a season, it was a verdict. In the 1880s, winter didn't care how hard you worked, how confident you sounded, or how many times something had always worked before. When the cold came, it tested every choice a man had made with his hands months earlier. Bad decisions froze quietly at night. Good ones stayed standing. Out here, survival was not about comfort. It was about endurance. About whether your shelter could hold heat after the fire died down. About whether your body could rest instead of feeding flames every hour just to stay alive. Winter turned construction into a moral issue. Build right and your family lived. Build wrong and no amount of effort could save you. Most settlers believed they already had the answer. Logs, timber frames, chinked seams, a hearth or cast iron stove if you were lucky. Wood was familiar. Wood felt warm to the touch. Wood looked right. And because it looked right, few people questioned it. But winter does not reward familiarity, it rewards physics. When temperatures dropped 40 degrees between day and night, when wind found every crack you missed, when firewood piles shrank faster than expected, the truth became obvious. Heating a cabin was not about how hot the fire burned. It was about what happened when the fire stopped. Frontier winters exposed a hard fact most people didn't want to hear. Air does not remember heat. Burn wood all night, and by morning the warmth is gone. Miss one feeding of the fire and the cold comes back fast. This is why winter was feared more than hunger. You could hunt again. You could trap again. But once your shelter failed, there was no recovery. The cold took strength first, then judgment, then life. That is why winter judged men without mercy. It stripped away pride, tradition, and assumption. It showed which ideas were sound and which were simply repeated. And it is why in the autumn of one particular year, when a man chose to build in stone instead of wood, the laughter around him mattered far less than what the coming winter would decide. Because winter never lies. The man did not arrive with big plans or loud opinions. He arrived with tools that showed their age and hands that showed their use. He was in his early 50s, older than most men trying to start over on the frontier. His shoulders were narrow, his posture straight, his movements careful but confident. Nothing about him suggested hurry. He had already survived winters that killed younger men. He came from a place where stone mattered, where walls were stacked without mortar and still stood after centuries, where cold did not announce itself with drama, but crept in slowly and stayed. In those places, people learned early that heat was not something you chased, it was something you trapped. He had spent much of his life working stone by hand, not monuments, not grand buildings, practical structures, root cellars that kept food alive, low cottages that stayed warm without constant fire, walls meant to resist time, not impress neighbors. What shaped him most was not training, but consequence. He had seen what happened when homes were built light and fast. He had seen families burn themselves thin feeding fires through long nights. He had seen men mistake activity for progress, noise for warmth. So when he looked at frontier cabins rising around him, he didn't see ingenuity. He saw risk. Logs cracked as they dried. Mud chinking pulled away with the first deep freeze. Fireplaces placed against outside walls bled heat into the dark. These weren't small flaws. They were design failures that winter would punish. He understood something many did not. Survival was not about fighting the cold harder. It was about reducing how often you had to fight it at all. That belief made him quiet. It made him patient, and it made him willing to look foolish for a while. When others talked about speed, he talked about longevity. When others planned for evenings, he planned for nights. When others asked how warm a cabin felt, at first he asked how cold it became when the fire went out. That way of thinking did not come from theory. It came from winters that never forgave mistakes. And it was that experience, older than the frontier itself, that guided every decision he was about to make. Log cabins earned their reputation because they were fast, not because they were efficient. On the frontier, speed mattered. A man with an axe and a few neighbors could raise walls in days. Trees were everywhere. The skills were familiar. The method felt proven. But what worked quickly did not always work well. Most cabins were built light. Logs were stacked notched and sealed with mud moss or clay. At first, everything looked tight. Then the wood dried. Gaps opened, chinking cracked. Wind found its way in. The problem wasn't craftsmanship, it was material behavior. Wood moves, it shrinks, swells, twists, and splits. And winter exploited every change. Heat escaped through seams too small to see. Cold air sank to the floor. Warm air rose and vanished through roofs that were never meant to hold it. Families learned quickly that heating a log cabin meant heating the outdoors at the same time. So they burned more wood, a lot more. A typical cabin consumed 6 to 8 cords of firewood in a hard winter. Cutting that much wood took time, strength, and daylight. Every hour spent splitting logs was an hour not spent hunting, trapping repairing tools, or resting. Fatigue became part of the heating system. Even with iron stoves, the problem remained. Stoves heated air, not structure. When the fire burned hot, the room felt warm near the metal and cold everywhere else. When the fire died, the temperature dropped fast. This created a brutal cycle. Wake up cold, feed the fire, stay close to the stove, sleep lightly, wake up again, repeat for months. People accepted this as normal. They blamed the climate, not the design. But winter didn't demand suffering. Poor thermal thinking did. The cabins failed quietly, not all at once, not in collapse. They failed in small ways: frozen water buckets, sleepless nights, burned hands, exhausted bodies. And because everyone built the same way, few questioned it, except one man who had learned long ago that warmth wasn't about how fast you burned fuel. It was about what stayed warm after the flames were gone. He chose stone when everyone else chose speed. By early autumn, the settlement was racing the calendar. Trees were falling. Logs were stacked. Roofs went on fast because everyone knew what was coming. Snow erased mistakes. Cold punished delays. You built quickly or you paid for it later. That was when he began hauling stone. Not small pieces, full blocks. Heavy, awkward sandstone dragged from a nearby ridge and rolled into place by hand. 40, 50, sometimes 60 pounds at a time. No foundation first, no timber frame, just stone laid where walls were supposed to be. People noticed immediately. They assumed he was gathering material for a chimney. Then they realized he was stacking the stone in a circle. Thick, slow, careful. He wasn't building around wood. He was building instead of it. That's when the comments started. Stone was for cellars. Stone was for foundations. Stone was cold. Everyone knew that. You touched stone in winter and it pulled heat straight out of your skin. Wood felt warm. Wood belonged above ground. He heard all of it. He didn't respond. At a community meeting, someone finally asked him directly what he was doing. He explained it plainly. Thick walls, central fire. Heat stored in mass, not air. A structure that worked even when the fire went low. The room went quiet. Then the laughter came. Men who had survived multiple winters saw no reason to gamble on something unfamiliar. Winter was not the time for experiments. Tradition felt safer than theory. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He thanked them and went back to work. That choice mattered. On the frontier, arguing wasted energy. Building proved everything. Winter would decide who was right, not opinions shared around a table. So while others finished cabins and stacked massive wood piles, he kept laying stone. Slowly, precisely. Every block placed with intention. From the outside it looked foolish, late, heavy, wrong. But the man wasn't building for approval. He was building for January. And he knew something the others didn't yet understand. Winter doesn't care how a shelter looks in October. The biggest mistake people made was confusing how something felt with how it worked. Touch cold stone in winter and it feels harsh. It steals heat from your skin fast. Touch wood and it feels warmer even when both are the same temperature. That sensation shaped belief. People trusted what felt comfortable in the moment. But winter does not reward surface impressions. It rewards behavior over time. Wood is an insulator. That sounds good, and sometimes it is. Insulation slows heat transfer, but it also prevents storage. When you heat a wooden cabin, you are mostly heating air. Air warms quickly, but it forgets just as fast. The moment the fire weakens, the warmth disappears. Stone behaves differently. Stone absorbs heat slowly. It holds it, and it releases it slowly long after the fire has burned down. This is not theory. It is measurable behavior. Stone has thermal mass. That means it doesn't panic when the temperature drops. It doesn't respond instantly. It resists change. When heated, it becomes a reservoir. When the fire fades, the stone gives heat back in steady waves instead of sudden loss. People called stone cold because they interacted with it incorrectly. They touched unheated stone and judged the entire material by that moment. But once stone is warm, it stays warm. And once it stays warm, it stabilizes everything around it. The man understood this instinctively, not from textbooks, from experience. From nights spent in stone cottages where the fire died hours before dawn, yet the room remained livable. From watching wooden huts turn icy the moment flames stopped. He wasn't trying to beat winter with bigger fires. He was trying to make fire unnecessary for long stretches of time. Stone didn't fight the cold. It ignored it. That was the real advantage. Not comfort, but consistency. Not heat spikes, but endurance. Winter is relentless, but predictable. It does the same thing every night. Stone answers that predictability with patience. Wood reacts. Stone remembers. And in a place where survival depended on what happened after midnight, memory mattered more than speed. The shape mattered as much as the material. He didn't build square. Corners bleed heat. Wind gathers there. Cold settles in angles and waits. Instead, he built round. A continuous wall, no weak points, no exposed edges for winter to grip. The walls were thicker than anyone thought reasonable. 2 feet of stone laid with care, packed tight, not because he feared collapse, but because mass was the goal. Every extra inch was storage. Every added stone was another hour of warmth later on. He kept openings to a minimum. 1 door, 1 small window. Light mattered, but heat mattered more. Glass was a liability in winter. Doors leaked warmth every time they opened, so he placed them deliberately not where they looked balanced, but where they made sense. The fire was not pushed against an outside wall like in most cabins. It sat in the center of the structure, low and contained. That decision alone changed everything. Heat rose evenly. Stone absorbed it from all sides. Nothing was wasted warming the outdoors. He thought in terms of hours, not moments. How long would the structure stay warm after the fire went out? How evenly would it cool? How much effort would it take to bring it back up to temperature? Most builders focused on the first few hours of the evening. He focused on the coldest part of the night. The roof followed the same logic. Solid, heavy, insulated with timber and earth. Not elegant, not fast, but effective. Warm air didn't rush out. It lingered. From the outside, it didn't look like a home. It looked like a storage building, a tower, something unfinished. People judged it by appearance because that was easy. But winter never judges appearances, it judges performance. Every design choice he made asked one question. What happens when the fire is low and the wind is high? That question shaped everything. He wasn't building a shelter to impress neighbors in autumn. He was building a system that would carry him through February. And systems don't care how they look. They only care if they work. Most frontier homes treated fire like a constant emergency. The fire went out. The house went cold, so the fire could never go out. Someone had to wake up at night, add wood watch embers, and keep the heat alive. Fire controlled the household schedule. Sleep was broken into short pieces. Rest was a luxury. He rejected that idea completely. Fire to him was not a permanent companion. It was a tool, and like any good tool, it was used with purpose, not panic. He did not build his structure around a roaring blaze. He built it around what happened after the blaze was gone. The goal was never to keep flames burning all night. The goal was to load heat into the stone while the fire was active, then let the structure do the work. Fire charged the system. Stone carried it forward. That changed how much wood he needed. Instead of feeding the fire constantly, he burned fewer logs but burned them well. Hot, clean fires for a limited time. Enough to warm the mass. Enough to store energy. Then he let it rest. This approach conserved fuel, but more importantly, it conserved people. No one had to hover over flames. No one had to wake every hour. The house did not demand attention to survive. That mattered more than comfort. Fatigue killed just as surely as cold. Others believed fire was the solution. He understood fire was only the beginning. Once heat entered the stone, it moved slowly. It radiated from walls, floors, and surrounding mass. Not sharp bursts of heat, but steady presence. The kind that lets muscles relax and sleep deepen. This was not about clever tricks. It was about respect for energy. Use it once. Store it. Spend it carefully. Winter punished waste. He designed a system that refused to waste anything fuel, effort, or time. That is why his fire burned small while others burned large. And that is why when winter reached its worst, his home did not depend on flame to remain alive. At first people joked. Then they grew quiet. By late November, the cabins were finished. Roofs sealed. Wood piles stacked high. Men stood back and admired their work, knowing they had beaten the calendar just in time. Snow came early that year, light at first, then heavier, settling into corners and drifts that didn't melt. That was when attention shifted. While smoke poured thick and dark from cabin chimneys morning and night, his chimney barely whispered. Just a thin line rising slowly into the cold air. No rush, no urgency. People noticed that before they noticed anything else. They rode past his place and slowed their horses. They counted how often he split wood. They watched how little he carried inside. Some assumed he was behind schedule. Others assumed he was in trouble and too proud to admit it. But trouble makes noise. Trouble smells like panic and green wood burning fast. His place stayed quiet. When the first hard freeze hit, men woke to ice on the inside of their cabin walls. Water buckets stiffened overnight. Boots left near doors turned rigid by morning. Fires were fed harder, earlier, longer. And still his chimney stayed calm. That unsettled people. No one likes to discover they might be wrong when winter has already begun. By then there is no fixing mistakes. You live with them. A few men stopped making jokes. They started making excuses instead. Maybe he had more wood hidden. Maybe he wasn't sleeping much. Maybe he'd leave when the real cold arrived. They told themselves that because the alternative was uncomfortable. Because if his stone structure worked, then all the noise, all the labor, all the suffering happening in the cabins wasn't necessary. And that was a hard thing to face. So they watched. Winter had not yet delivered its verdict, but it was close. And when it arrived, there would be no arguing with the outcome. January arrived without apology. The temperature dropped in steps at first, then all at once. Nights sank into single digits, then below zero. Wind cut across the valley and found every weakness men had sealed too quickly or ignored entirely. This was the cold that exposed truth. Cabins that had felt good enough in December began to fail. Fires burned hotter and longer, yet rooms stayed uneven. One corner warm, another barely livable. Families clustered close to stoves. Children slept in layers meant for outdoors. Sleep came in fragments. Wood piles shrank fast. Men rose before dawn to split frozen logs with stiff hands. Axes rang in the dark. Breath burned lungs. Every task took longer because cold stole strength quietly. The work never ended. And still cabins cooled the moment fires dipped. That was when assumptions broke. People assumed more fire meant more warmth. It didn't. It meant faster exhaustion. They assumed insulation alone was enough. It wasn't. They assumed what felt warm to the touch would perform well over time. It didn't. Across the valley, one structure behaved differently. His place did not spike in heat, then crash. It stayed steady. The walls themselves felt alive with warmth. Not hot, not dramatic, just present. He did not burn through the night. He did not wake to feed the fire. When morning came, the interior was still livable, still calm. That contradicted everything people believed about winter living. The cold did not break his system because it was built to absorb punishment, not react to it. While cabins fought the cold hour by hour, his structure ignored it. This was the point where winter stopped being theoretical. Men could argue in autumn. They could debate materials and traditions. But January erased a debate. Results replaced opinions. The cold did not care what builders believed. It only revealed what their buildings could do when no one was watching. And what it revealed that winter was unsettling. Because one man building slower, burning less, and working quieter was doing something the others could not. He was resting. Frontier people respected results more than arguments. Once the cold settled in, talk lost its power. What mattered was temperature wood burned and how people felt in the morning. So someone finally did what should have been done from the start. They measured. One of the older men in the settlement kept a thermometer. He'd learned the habit in the army where guessing got men killed. When rumors spread that the stone structure stayed warm with little fire, he decided to document it properly. He started with the cabins. Inside temperatures were taken in the early morning, the coldest part of the day. Most cabins sat in the mid-40s. A few reached the low 50s, but only after burning wood all night. In every case, the fire had been fed constantly. Wood consumption was heavy. Everyone knew how much they were burning because they felt it in their arms. Then he walked to the stone structure. The difference was immediate. The air felt even. Not sharp heat near a stove, not cold at the floor. Just steady warmth. The thermometer confirmed it. Upper 60s near the center of the room. No roaring fire, no panic, just stored heat doing its work. He asked how much wood had been burned since the night before. The answer was uncomfortable for everyone listening. Less than a quarter of what the cabins had used. Numbers change conversations fast. This wasn't about toughness or luck. It wasn't about suffering less because of personality. It was about performance. The stone structure maintained a larger temperature difference using far less fuel. No one argued after that. There was nothing left to argue about. Winter doesn't negotiate, it measures. For the first time, people understood what they were seeing. The stone wasn't fighting the cold. It was smoothing it out. Absorbing heat when available. Releasing it when needed. The cabins reacted to winter minute by minute. The stone structure planned for it. That was the difference. From that moment on, the laughter stopped completely. Curiosity replaced it. Not admiration. Not pride. Just practical interest. Because on the frontier, when something works better, you don't mock it. You study it. The real test came when the fire was allowed to die. Not by accident, on purpose. Late one evening, after the structure had been fully warmed, he added a final log and let it burn down naturally. No refueling, no stirring coals, no getting up in the night. The flames faded, then disappeared entirely. In a log cabin, this would have been a mistake. Within hours, the room would have turned cold. By morning, breath would fog the air and frost would creep along the walls. That didn't happen here. Hour by hour, the temperature dropped slowly, not sharply, not suddenly. The walls released what they had stored one layer at a time. The floor stayed warm. The air stayed stable. The cold stayed outside. By midnight, the space was still comfortable. By early morning, it was cooler but far from dangerous. No shock, no cliff, just a gradual decline. This was the difference between storage and reaction. Cabins reacted to the absence of fire immediately. Stone did not. Stone had memory. The man slept through the night without waking. That alone would have been enough to prove the point. Rest was rare on the frontier in winter. Unbroken sleep meant clearer judgment, stronger bodies, fewer mistakes. When people asked how long the warmth lasted, he answered honestly, many hours. Long enough to get through the coldest part of the night. Long enough to wake up without panic. The key was not magic, it was patience. Thermal mass does not rush. It absorbs heat slowly and it gives it back the same way. That slow release flattened the temperature curve that punished wooden buildings. Instead of peaks and crashes, there was balance. This changed how people thought about heating. The goal was no longer constant fire. The goal was continuity, stability, predictable warmth that didn't depend on constant attention. Winter demands systems that work while you rest. That night proved the stone structure was not just warm when things went right, it was forgiving when they didn't. And forgiveness is what keeps people alive when conditions turn brutal. From then on, no one doubted what they were seeing. They started asking how to build it. No one likes to be proven wrong by the weather. On the frontier, pride was usually defended with silence. Men didn't apologize easily. They didn't like admitting mistakes, especially after surviving enough winters to believe their way was the right way. But winter has a way of breaking pride without humiliating it. The change didn't come through arguments or speeches. It came through quiet visits. One man at a time, standing in the doorway, feeling the warmth, looking at the fire, doing the math in his head. The first questions were cautious. How thick are the walls? Where is the fire placed? How much wood do you really burn? These weren't challenges. They were attempts to understand. What surprised everyone was how open he was. He didn't guard the knowledge. He didn't claim ownership. He didn't say, "I told you so." He explained everything plainly. What mattered was not being right. What mattered was that fewer people suffered. That attitude lowered defenses. Men who had mocked him weeks earlier now listened closely, not because they were embarrassed, but because they were tired. Tired of chopping wood before dawn, tired of sleeping in layers, tired of fighting the same battle every night. One carpenter admitted something quietly. He had built tight cabins for decades and still winter punished them. That wasn't failure. It was limitation. Once that was acknowledged, learning became possible. Pride didn't shatter, it adjusted. This is how real knowledge spreads in hard places. Not through victory laps, but through usefulness. Not by proving others wrong, but by making their lives easier. Frontier culture respected results, but it respected generosity even more. A man who solved a problem and shared the solution earned trust fast. By midwinter, the stone structure was no longer an oddity. It was a reference point. A place people compared their homes to. A standard, not an exception. No one talked about laughter anymore. They talked about changes they could still make before the next winter. Because when survival is on the line, pride becomes a luxury most people are willing to give up. On the frontier, knowledge didn't spread through books or meetings. It spread through observation. Men watched what worked. They copied what mattered. They ignored everything else. No one rebuilt an entire home in the middle of winter. That wasn't realistic. But small changes were possible, and those changes added up fast. One man added a thick stone hearth behind his iron stove. Not for looks, for mass. He let the stone absorb heat during the evening burn. By morning, the room stayed warmer than it ever had before. He burned less wood the next night, then less again. Another buried stone under his cabin floor near the stove. The heat soaked downward, then came back slowly. The floor stopped feeling like ice. His children slept better. That was enough proof. A trapper who spent most nights away from home took a simpler lesson. He heated smooth river stones by the fire before bed, wrapped them in leather, and placed them near his sleeping area. They stayed warm for hours, on the trail that meant rest instead of shivering. These weren't copies of the original structure. They were adaptations. Frontier people were good at that. They took principles, not plans. The principle was simple: store heat when you have it, use it when you don't. By spring, several homes had changed how they handled winter. Not dramatically, quietly. Their wood piles lasted longer. Their nights grew calmer. Their mornings started with strength instead of fatigue. No one named the method. They didn't need to. It became part of how things were done. This is how old knowledge survives. not by staying intact, but by being useful enough to be reused. The man who started it didn't claim credit. He didn't care who adopted what. The work spoke for itself. And that is why the idea traveled farther than he ever did. People carried it to neighboring valleys, to logging camps, to family homesteads miles away. It spread because it reduced suffering, because it saved fuel, because it made winter manageable. Good ideas don't need promotion. They just need to work when conditions are worst. What surprised people most was not that the stone structure worked. It was that it had worked before, many times, in many places. Once the shock wore off, the older men began to recognize the pattern. Someone mentioned Roman bathhouses where heat was routed under stone floors to warm entire buildings. Another remembered reading about massive masonry stoves in Eastern Europe that were fired once a day and stayed warm until morning. None of this was modern. None of it was experimental. Humans had been using thermal mass for thousands of years. They just used it where survival demanded efficiency and forgot it where fuel felt abundant. In cold parts of Russia, families built stoves so large you could sleep on them. They burned hot for a short time, then let the stone do the rest. In Korea, heated floors carried warmth across entire homes through stone channels. In the American Southwest, thick adobe walls kept interiors cool by day and warm by night using the same principle. These weren't cultural quirks. They were solutions shaped by necessity. What happened on the frontier wasn't invention. It was reintroduction. The man didn't bring something new. He brought something proven into a place that had forgotten it. Frontier builders came from timber traditions because trees were familiar, not because timber was always better. Convenience replaced memory. Wood was fast, stone was slow, and in a rush to survive the first winter, people chose speed over strategy. That made sense at the time. But once winter revealed the cost, people began to remember older answers. The lesson was uncomfortable but clear. Progress doesn't always mean improvement. Sometimes it just means forgetting what used to work. Thermal mass never stopped being effective. It simply stopped being popular. And when conditions became harsh enough again, the old knowledge returned without needing permission. That's how survival wisdom behaves. It disappears when ignored. It returns when required. Winter doesn't care how advanced you think you are. It only asks one question: does your shelter still work when everything else fails? Modern buildings are comfortable, but they are fragile. They rely on constant input: electricity, gas, oil, systems that must stay active every minute to keep a space livable. When those systems stop, comfort disappears fast. Frontier structures were different. They were designed to coast. They assumed failure would happen. Fires would go out. Weather would worsen. Fuel would run short. So the structure itself had to carry the load. Heat was stored. Cold was delayed. Time was built into the walls. That mindset is mostly gone. Today, efficiency is measured by how quickly a system responds, not how long it lasts without attention. Homes heat up fast, but cool down just as fast. They are optimized for convenience, not resilience. We traded endurance for speed. That trade made sense when energy became cheap and reliable. But it came with a cost. Modern homes forget heat the same way wooden cabins did. They depend on machines to compensate for design choices that ignore thermal mass entirely. When power fails in winter, the problem isn't discomfort. It's time. How long can a house stay above freezing without help? For many modern homes, the answer is measured in hours, not days. The frontier builders didn't have that luxury. Their structures had to work even when nothing else did. The stone structure taught a lesson that still applies. Real efficiency isn't about output. It's about retention. It's about reducing how often you must intervene to stay alive. That lesson matters now more than ever. Energy costs rise. Grids fail. Weather grows more extreme. The conditions that made thermal mass essential are returning. This isn't about nostalgia. It's about design honesty. The past didn't build this way because it was romantic. It built this way because failure was not an option. Modern life gained convenience, but it lost patience. And patience, stored quietly in stone, is what carried people through the worst winters without panic. The real lesson was never about stone. Stone was just the teacher. What that winter revealed was something deeper and harder to accept. Survival does not reward confidence. It rewards alignment with reality. Physics does not negotiate. Weather does not care how things have always been done. Nature responds only to what works. The man understood that. He didn't argue with winter. He didn't try to overpower it. He worked with its rules. That is the frontier mindset at its best. Too often people confuse tradition with truth. They repeat methods because they are familiar, not because they are optimal. On the frontier, that habit could cost lives. Winter corrected those errors quickly. The stone structure stood as quiet proof. Not loud, not dramatic, just reliable. It didn't demand constant attention. It didn't punish mistakes immediately. It gave people time, and time in extreme conditions is everything. There is humility in that approach. The man never claimed he was smarter than others. He simply trusted knowledge that had already been tested by harsher places and longer histories. He respected what generations before him had learned the hard way. That respect mattered more than innovation. In the end, the laughter stopped because evidence replaced opinion. The structure didn't win because it was clever. It won because it reduced suffering. It saved fuel. It allowed rest. It made winter survivable instead of miserable. That is how real progress happens, quietly, without ego. The frontier did not need heroes. It needed systems that worked when people were tired, cold, and human. Stone delivered that by remembering heat when fire could not. The structure itself is gone now. Roads replace clearings. Modern buildings stand where it once did. But the lesson remains. When conditions get hard, old knowledge returns. Not because it is old, but because it is proven. The past is not primitive, it is tested. And when winter comes again, whether in weather energy or uncertainty, the people who listen to what Stone once taught will be the ones who stay standing.